The main event of today, then, is to hear from Professor Martin Innes. Martin, I'm just going to put the spotlight on you because that's a fabulous Zoom feature. Okay, so you're under the spotlight now, and here we go. Great. So one of the things we've been thinking about, obviously, is where we are at this particular moment in time, and we're 6 months out from the Senate elections in May next year. The world has changed in ways that we don't even fully understand, even if we were to recognize them. And information is circulating and impacting on people's lives in a very, very different way too. So we're really, really delighted to be joined by Professor Martin Innes from Cardiff University. Martin's a criminologist by training and works a lot now on the impact of social media on the spread of disinformation. I know, Martin, you're working with the UK government on a number of things, so there'll be things that you might need to be relatively circumspect about in terms of what you can share and what you can't. But I know that you have done work in terms of monitoring the EU elections in 2019, information operations and disinformation campaigns in 15 EU countries. You've got a team of data scientists and social behavioural experts working with you, and there's some interesting stuff about the US elections, obviously, too, which we've all watched endlessly on loop on CNN for 72 hours plus, after which everybody's eyes hurt and ears hurt. Martin, I'm going to let you just run with this and jump in if there are any particular questions. If you do have questions for Martin, please do post them in the chat and I will pick them up and feed them through. So Martin, you don't have to pick them up from the chat. But could you just tell us a bit, please, about some of the things that you've observed in your EU and US election monitoring? Because we want to have our eyes open, don't we, as we're in the run up to May.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation and good evening, everybody. So I guess my starting point is when we start talking about disinformation and misinformation, and I'll come on and define the terms a little bit in a moment. I mean, this isn't new. Rumors, propaganda, conspiracy theories, that stuff's been around ever since we've had politics. But what the internet and the ways in which social media platforms have done is kind of given this stuff rocket boosters. And where we find ourselves now is in a situation where pretty much every politically contentious event that happens around the world acts as a magnet for disinformation, conspiracy theories, and the like. And so I've got a smallish research unit, and about 10 years ago, it was studying rumors and how they kind of create riots and civil disorder was a very, very small part of what we did. Now it's pretty much everything that we do. So I've got a team of 12 researchers working full time. We work for UK government, we work for the EU, we work for others. We've got a strategic partnership with Facebook trying to understand how this stuff happens. And we've worked across pretty much all of Europe and North America, trying to understand what's going on at the moment. And there are a number of particular challenges kind of coming up. It's easy to be pessimistic about these kind of things, but I genuinely do think things are they're not getting any better in terms of the situation. And anybody who has been tracking the US election will have been able to kind of see just how profoundly bad things can really be getting in terms of the political space. But it's not just happening in America. And there are a number of challenges kind of coming through at the moment. So the first thing is actually being able to detect disinformation or misinformation in the first place. And so misinformation is generally referred to when people unintentionally communicate misleading information. Disinformation is the term that's used now for when it is purposive and deliberate.
Yeah.
A lot of these techniques were pioneered by the Russians, the Soviets, And they used to talk about, there's a few memoirs that have been written about this, and they used to talk about the best disinformation, the best active measures, as they refer to them, always have a grain of truth in them. And we're seeing that a lot at the moment. So if people think about the US election, the Hunter Biden laptop story that came out.
Do you want to just set out? Do you want to just set out what that was, in case people don't know?
Yeah. So Hunter Biden is obviously the son of Joe Biden. A story emerged in the New York Post that his laptop had been put into a repair shop, a computer repair shop, and information from the laptop had been downloaded and made available to the media from a number of different sources. Potentially, we're still not sure quite how that happened. Some of the detail was politically embarrassing for Joe Biden. Some of it was alleging corruption, and some of it was alleging sexual improprieties and drug use and the like. Our best assessment currently is that probably somehow someone had got access to genuine material from his laptop. But then as the story developed through the media, other actors came in and introduced very, very false material into the story that was then publicized and used to smear Hunter Biden and by extension, Joe Biden. And that's what we're seeing a lot at the moment, is that it's not purely false information, but it is layering in false information on top of material that is genuinely there. So we've got that. So there's quite a problem in detecting what is false and what is not. Sometimes there is a problem in identifying who is responsible for this, because we have a range of actors engaging in propagating disinformation from a number of hostile states, for whom the majority, the most recognized are Russia, China, and Iran. But there are others engaging in this as well. But increasingly, we've also seen the domestication of these kind of tactics, whereby there are domestic actors, groups within any society, any community, who for political manipulation purposes will seek to use very similar kinds of tactics as well. And then there is a problem within all of this of trying to work out what impact it has. How much difference does it really make? And some of these kind of questions are quite challenging.
So, you know, we're sometimes I think we can think that nobody's going to take any notice of things that are going on in Wales, but we're obviously at a key moment in terms of the makeup of the UK, the constitutional, you know, the way the constitution of the UK does not work. Can you tell us a little bit about Scotland and what you've seen in terms of the Scottish referendum and any potential involvement there, and what you see we might need to both be alive to over the next 6 months and potential implications for Wales?
Yeah, sure. So we know that back in 2014, in the Scottish independence referendum, there was a Russian campaign that targeted the independence vote, and that's pretty well documented. In 2016, there were allegations of a Russian campaign targeting the Brexit vote as well. We're less clear about, certainly in terms of the digital online internet kind of part of that, how much impact and influence the Russians actually had, but there were definitely known and validated Russian accounts that were trying to amplify levels of discord and disquiet. And I think we learned a little bit about the tactics there. So it wasn't necessarily that they were just talking to a UK audience. A lot of the Russian messaging at the time was targeting Germany, because Germany was seen as being the surrogate for the EU more generally. So kind of scrolling forward and kind of learning from that, there is undoubtedly a sense in which the fragmentation of Europe and the fragmentation of the EU is something that is a geopolitical strategic objective for certain countries around the world. I think it's important for the forthcoming elections to be thinking about, it's not just about the elections. So it's going to be the elections overlain by COVID, overlain by whatever happens in terms of Brexit. And particularly, I think, important will be what happens with the Scottish independence movement. If that starts to gain ground, then I think that may have implications for people looking at Wales in terms of what fissures and fractures can be amplified, and what can you kind of create a wedge issue.
Yeah, because there are lots of things that we've all taken for granted, I think, for a very long time, or just assumed that that's the way things are. And what the last 8 months has taught us is that that's not the case anymore. All of those givens have been, whether you agreed with them or wanted them or not, and I make no comment on that, they've been, the rug's been pulled out from underneath them. So when we're thinking about vaccines, obviously you and I talked, before about, how the 3 now potential vaccines might play out in that space, and the hesitancy of people taking them up, as well as, so there's the anti-vaxxers campaign, and we know how that's played out previously, but also people who still seem to think that COVID is one great big hoax in itself. So there's that. The other major uncertainty, obviously, being around Brexit, and we're 5-6 weeks out from a great big 10-ton lorry hitting us in the face in terms of all our lives. I'm not going to extend that any further because there are going to be so many of them parked in Kent, not able to get anywhere. But what that means, and we just don't know. But there's also the uncertainty in terms of that push for independence in Scotland, and also the rise in the pro-independence movement in Wales, which is gaining traction, isn't it, across parties and across party lines. So I think a good reminder in terms of it not just being about the election, it's also about more than that. Yeah,
and I mean, I think of those, the vaccine hesitancy thing, and the what happens in relation to COVID is very, very important, because we know, for example, you can already see if you watch these things that Mark Drakeford, because of the stance that he's taken, is very, very unpopular with the QAnon kind of movement and the people on that sort of end of the spectrum. And certainly when we've looked in other places across Europe, one of the things that you see is these people are very digitally savvy, actually, in terms of what they do. And they can run very, very technically adept smear campaigns against political parties and political leaders. And a particularly good example of that we worked on was in Moldova, not the recent elections, but the round of elections before. And we saw a very, very sophisticated smear campaign run against the lady who was voted in as president of Moldova, which involved really quite technically sophisticated ways of doing things in order to create a smear about her and her suitability for office. And one of the things that we've been watching, of course, is that you see people learning from what happens elsewhere, and those kind of tactics and techniques get imported into domestic politics.
So we should be under no illusions that there will be a focus on how things play out in Wales. And do you see any? I mean, today's group of IWA members have been very politically engaged. IWA members tend to be very politically aware and engaged in any case. But in terms of how political parties might start running their campaigns, any things? I know that there was a warning to them from the Information Commissioner's Office recently about how they use personal data coming from their members and the manipulation of that. What sort of things should we be watching out for, both as citizens, but also as activists and campaigners in this space around free and fair elections? I mean, is it a stretch to say, can we have free elections, fair elections in Wales, or do we need to be even more alive to this sort of manipulation than we have been before? Because the intention of them, can't be taken for granted that they should run smoothly. On the one hand, we've seen that play out in America in a very, very extreme way, clearly. In Wales, though, it's not, every election is important, isn't it? It's the voice of the citizens of that country that needs to be heard. So what sort of things should we be aware of, and what do you see as the role of IWA members and others in pointing out that disinformation?
Yeah, I mean, I genuinely do think that there is a very, very important role for places like IWA. I mean, in some of the countries that we work, it is the non-governmental organisations, the think tanks, that are really, really critical to the preservation of civil society and the kind of democratic integrity that I think everybody really, really values. So I think the first thing is to be aware that this is probably going to happen, and to be willing and have set up mechanisms by which you can expose this kind of thing and call it out. And it's recognizing it won't necessarily just be oppositional and adversarial kind of thing. Some of the really sneaky stuff happens internally within parties. So in the run up to the 2019 UK general election, a lot of the things that we were looking at were, for example, the hard right in the Conservative Party looking to get their candidates selected rather than people that they saw were soft on Brexit. And I think you could see potentially, there are splits and fractures within Labour at the moment. So quite how that will play out. And I think that's going to be a big issue. I think the vaccine hesitancy, QAnon, conspiratorial community could be very influential in what happens in Wales. We know that there are a number of prominent figures aligned with those kind of movements living in Wales. They have a media operation that is running in Wales and pushing out material on that. And it's one of those things, you have to be prepared for it, because by the time it happens, information and communication moves so fast these days that these things will be out if you're not prepared for them. So it's kind of got to be a very rapid kind of response. So you've got to have it set up and understand how you're going to do this.
Yeah, so I think we've seen that over the last 8 months, haven't we, in terms of the regulations and how speedily the regulations have been changed, and what that means for how people understand what they can and can't do in relation to COVID. So it sounds like a call for coordinated action among civil society in relation to that. There's a comment in the chat from Richard Ely, which is what's special about this. It's always happened. And, vaccine hesitancy is a natural human reaction to what is as yet an unproven leap in the dark. What would you say to that, Martin?
I think it's the speed and scale thing that happens at the current time. I mean, and I did preface my remarks by saying, this is not new, but it is the speed and scale, and I think it is also the uncertainty that it creates. So I have kids who are kind of teenagers coming into that, and I can't work out if they're really savvy with all of this stuff, or they're just living their life in this bubble where this kind of thing is what they're exposed to, and they have quite a high degree of familiarity with some of the narratives and some of the things that are going on. And they have different relationship to news than perhaps our generation had. And
they're experiencing it in a different way, aren't they? I mean, you know, I've seen there's a big piece of work that I think the Finnish or the Danish government were doing with school children, getting them to recognize misinformation online. I don't know if it went as far as disinformation as part of their PSEA education, part of the curriculum. But I wonder whether with young people now being allowed to vote in the next Senate elections, is that too much of an expectation in terms of understanding? We know that people who can vote already don't understand how the system works and how to get their voices heard. We all, even that it matters in terms of the turnout that we've had in elections so far for what was the Assembly and is now the Senate. But putting those two things together, because I think you're right, talk to anybody over the age of 35, that it's a totally different gig in terms of how people consume the media and news. News is a different thing. People don't, and we know that from our media policy work at the IWA. So how do you square those two things off? I mean, there's a question here from John Greystone, which is, are you an optimist or a pessimist in respect to the future of political discourse? Because that ability to have that open space, and how do you respond to disinformation as a citizen or as an organisation?
I'm perversely, I'm slightly more optimistic after the American elections than I was going into it, because I genuinely do think you saw some of the media institutions starting to rediscover their purpose and role and really starting to stand up on some of this and kind of call out and label it. But the thing that worries me is that it's not all about Facebook and Twitter, which is what a lot of the conversation seems to be about at the moment. And what we're seeing is a lot of this stuff is happening on very niche kind of platforms where people who wouldn't normally get together and interact are starting to get together and interact and exchange ideas. So the major growth that's happened recently is that Facebook and Twitter have been deplatforming a lot of accounts, and these people are going to platforms such as Parler and Gab and Telegram that normal people just don't go anywhere near. But traditionally, these have been occupied by those individuals with an affiliation to sort of hard right ideological perspectives. So what we're seeing people with vaccine hesitant alternative viewpoints coming into contact with people with hard right ideologies, and there aren't any counter voices in these places. And these platforms are deliberately set up as alternatives to Facebook and Twitter, as places where they are not going to censor and they're not going to moderate what happens. So a lot of people will be fine, but there are some things that we do need to worry about.
So it's a whole new world of which many of us have no knowledge and no experience of operating within as well, which is something different to be aware of. There's some interesting comments in the chat. Obviously, Richard Ely making a point about the need to distinguish between information and a viewpoint. So facts. There are no such thing as alternative facts, are they? Rather, facts are facts. And having a view and an opinion is something else. So we all know that, if you look at different news outlets elsewhere, you're going to see different agendas and different viewpoints. But an interesting question from Gethin Fries of Kateen, what can we learn from entirely false conspiracy theories of the past, which were effective long before social media platforms? I mean, your point about speed and scale and rumours running riot in a totally different way than they have done in the past is one thing. But where's that conversation happening around the holding to account for facts? Do we just all need to spend a part of our day calling it out when it's just not true, and providing that evidence and resourcing that in a totally different way? Because that's the job now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the historical point is very well made, actually, because we do know quite a lot about the conditions that foster these kind of, and the so what do we know from that kind of, actually uncertainty
Yeah.
um, is a breeding ground for these kinds of information to be communicated. And as we kind of rehearsed at the start of this, I mean, it is a profoundly uncertain period that we are going into where these elections are going to be held. The second element is they work better when there is a grain of truth. So when you're manipulating and amplifying rather than pure invention and fabrication. And then the third is they tend to play along existing fault lines.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have got existing tensions in a society between an in-group and an out-group or something like that, exploiting those is the most effective kind of ground. And there is a thing when you look at these, some of the information. So, for example, some of the information that the Internet Research Agency that was run out of St. Petersburg put out in the 2016 US election, when you look at it rationally and soberly, it's nonsense. But what it does is it tries to trigger people emotionally rather than rationally, and just get people angry, get people emotionally excited and engaged. And that's how this stuff kind of moves quite a lot of the time. And the company so Facebook, they got kind of better at spotting bots and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not necessarily the problem that we're going to face sort of going forward.
Okay, so there's a really good call to action for people on the call today to just think before you respond to something on Facebook or Twitter in terms of that emotional response, and think about what are the facts in this situation and share those and distinguish. I think, again, you know, and I know there are a number of journalists on the call as well. You know, often to close down a story, you might just think, well, leave well alone, but actually that's not the best thing to do in this situation. It's about saying, well, that bit's true, but this bit is absolutely not true. There's a question from Andy on the team, which is, has there been any profiling of who believes conspiracy theories? Are particular kinds of people more likely to be susceptible to disinformation than another? Is there any particular kind of person?
Yeah, so certainly on conspiracy theories, if you believe in one set of conspiracy theories, you're more likely to believe in others. There are, interestingly, so one of the pieces of work that we've done that we're progressively publishing the results from is we've done a survey of 700 citizens in each of 12 countries across Europe to try and work some of these things out. So, and you do see country level differences in terms of the vulnerability really to believe in these kind of trust in government
Mm-hmm.
is a biggie. So people who have low trust in government, low trust in other kinds of authorities are more susceptible to being influenced.
So that's going to play out very interestingly, isn't it? In terms of, at the moment, Welsh government currently has a high level of trust in terms of the handling of the COVID crisis, whereas the UK government has a lower level of trust. The issue being that many people in Wales don't understand which issues are devolved and which issues are reserved, so may not be able to distinguish between which government is deciding that.
Yeah, you know, and it gets quite complex quite quickly as well. There is, and there's an exposure effect as well. So high levels of use of multiple types of social media platform tend to expose you to more of this kind of information.
So there's a point from Ellen Jones in the chat just now in terms of comparisons with mass hysteria in the past, like the anti-Catholic riots, witch hunts, terrible persecutions of the Jews for centuries, bred out of that uncertainty and fear that you've just been talking about, but also the scapegoating of minorities. Do you think social media is just using a terrifying willingness of all people at all times to believe dreadful things of marginalized groups and individuals, and just sort of opening that even further?
Yeah, and I, you know, so if you look at a lot of the nasty kind of discourse that's kind of been going on, you know, the anti-Semitic kind of thing, the anti-refugee, the anti-migrant, the Black Lives Matter kind of racial justice, these have all been kind of fault lines that have been exploited. And I mean, interestingly, the other bit that we're picking up as a kind of emerging trend is a tendency to personally target and attack individuals as well. So one of the things that we're looking at quite carefully at the moment is there are a lot of smear campaigns being run against journalists. So as soon as journalists try to call out and expose some of these things, they are being subject to coordinated, quite nasty campaigns, some of which have consequences, really. And we don't understand really what the impact of that is. And we can see that there are particular tactics and techniques that are being used. So what happens is someone will plant the rumor online, and then a second person who is part of the coordinated operation comes in and comments on that, and a third actor then comes in and attacks the person commenting, because what they're doing is creating this idea that there's a conflict going on, which drives normal people out of the conversation. They get dominated.
I think what's you know, going back to, I'm going to just open up for any more questions in a tick, but going back to where we started, which was, you know, we've thought that we are immune to many of these problems, or that things like that don't happen here, and it's just not the case. It's never been the case. But I think, you know, the givens of our society have been smashed, and rightly so in many respects. And I'd say particularly in relation to Black Lives Matter this year, and who holds power and control on the one hand, and whose voices are being heard, and what the facts of the situation are in any event that's happening. But there's a call here. What I'm hearing from what you're saying, Martin, is a call that, you know, if you do see whether online or offline are piling in on individuals because of their gender or their politics or their position running a particular organisation, that it's important to stand shoulder to shoulder with them, obviously, to provide support, but also to take down any both misinformation that may be unintentional, but active disinformation too, that might have other intents.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, we have seen a number of organizations have got very effective at doing this across Europe. So if you go to places like Moldova and Ukraine, this kind of stuff is almost endemic. And what civil society and civic actors have done is become very effective at just being able to stop this stuff gathering momentum without being challenged.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed, Martin. Oh, there's a question just come in from Andy, which is, I think this builds on a blog that Andy wrote for the IWA. Could politicians and other public figures lead by example by being more open and explicit about when they've changed their minds in response to new evidence, and speaking about that as a good thing? Because there's a sense that you have a position and you must hold to it no matter what, but actually, you know, being dogmatic and inflexible is not a virtue. Should embracing that uncertainty be seen as a much more positive thing by everybody who is standing for public office?
Yeah, that's not my. There are people far better able to sort of comment on that on this call than I am. But I think there is certainly something in that about having a grown-up kind of perspective on this stuff that is quite often very hard.
Great. There's a question from John Greystone, which is, where have you published your team's research, Martin? Is it publicly available?
A lot of it. So a lot of it is for government, but there are some articles. So we published a piece on the Internet Research Agency in the journal Political Quarterly, and we've published a couple of other pieces. So there's an article in the British Journal of Sociology talking about the ways in which the Russians tried to exploit the 2017 terror attacks.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for those. Martin, really thank you very much indeed. I think it's a kind of sobering look at where things are at the moment in terms of elsewhere, and to think now about how we need to both be prepared and awake to what might be going on in an online space, affecting the both the judgments and the decisions of citizens who will be voting in May's election. So thank you very much indeed.